Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to vlog 254. Thought work. So many of the cliches in our lives about us, about our identity, involve thinking. You know, like, what was she thinking? What was she thinking? Or, you need to stop and think. Or Buddha's line, what we think, we become. So thinking remains a powerful and exhausting project. What we do so often in doctoral programs when we're trying to help you is think about the relationship between thinking, reading and writing. These three variables. So what's going on in the space between thinking and reading, reading and thinking? What's going on in the space between thinking and writing, writing and thinking? And of course, what's going on in the space between reading and writing and writing and reading? And we get all a bit involved with those variables. And if you think about it, they are the three variables that dance in our research life. And often it feels like they're sort of laughing at us a bit. Another way I describe the relationship between these three variables is like that shell game we used to play when we were kids. Remember, there'd be a ball and you'd have three shells, and the ball would be put under one of the shells, and then you'd shuffle it and try and guess where the ball is, right? And I think the problem in a PhD program is that too often we sort of think, oh right, the problem's reading. I'm not reading enough. I'm not reading enough. I'm not reading enough. And then you pick up the shell and the ball is not under the shell of reading. Similarly, I have students in my office every single day who say, Tara, I'm just not writing enough. Writing is my problem. And so we pick up the shell of writing and the ball isn't there. Because invariably you're lifting up the wrong shell. Where perhaps some of the issues we need to talk about emerge is through thinking. And indeed, thought work, a phrase I love. Now, I know a lot of you watching this vlog are feeling pretty lost at the moment. You know, invariably in a doctoral program you feel a bit lost, right? At the moment, with everything happening in the world, I really do understand the question that you're asking. Why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. And you know what? It's not a rhetorical question. It's an important question for you to answer. So in today's vlog, we're going to take a step back from the lab. We're going to take a step back from the lab. We're going to take a step away from the library stacks. We're going to not look at those surveys for a while, and I'm going to ask you to just move away from your computer keyboard, because we're going to take a walk together through thought work. And this is an important time in the world for us to have this conversation, because the world needs you. The world needs people who can enact thought work. Now, university academics are described through a lot of different nouns. You know, we are researchers, teachers, academics, faculty. But I've always liked thinker. What do you do for a living? I'm a thinker. And that's great, because I want to explore thinking and why thinking matters. And you'll notice I'm not using the phrase critical thinking. So I'll just get this, I'll park this right at the start. I'm not using the phrase critical thinking. I've done some research in that area through my career, particularly through critical literacies, and I've supervised a lot of PhD students that have used that phrase. I really don't use it, and I'll tell you why. Because what exactly is the difference between critical thinking and non-critical thinking? I'm arguing today that thinking is always critical, powerful, engaged. Non-critical thinking is actually not thinking. It's existing, not living. It's going with the flow. So if a person is not thinking, they're able to live in cliches. They're able to live in comfortable narratives that make them feel good about themselves, fitting in with a group rather than offering the challenges that are required to enact change. So my argument today is that thought work is interventionist work. It's using our intellectual expertise as a knife to cut away mediocrity, to cut away compliance, to cut away conformity. Therefore, I'm not using the phrase critical thinking. I'm suggesting to you that thinking is always critical and engaged and active. Thinking is integral to the academic identity. It is what we do. It is who we are. So this vlog asks you, to ponder actively thought work as the business of research. And look, I'm assisted with this amazing topic. I've loved writing this vlog, but I've been assisted in the writing of this topic with 3 great books that have all emerged at this point in intellectual history, and also the truly bizarre start to 2021. So I'm recording this in the first couple of months of 2021, and it's been pretty weird. It's been pretty weird, and I've sat back and wondered a lot what's going on here. And I watched the rioting in the US Capitol, and I asked the obvious question. I was watching this before my eyes. I asked the question, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? And then I realised they weren't thinking. They were reacting. They were living inside a prejudice. They were living inside a discrimination. Living inside irrationality. Living inside error. So, academic life must be different. We as scholars have failed the planet when a large minority of our citizens, let alone our students, but our citizens, choose to see the truth in the lie, or potential in an error. So as an inspiration model and node for our discussion, I wanted to talk about the ideas of 2 great men, 2 great thinkers, Sykes and David Matza. They've showed that we can live a long life and yet remain engaged as thinkers. Their most famous article, published in 1957 in the American Sociological Review, was titled Techniques of Neutralization. It's one of my favourite articles ever published. So they produced the article, they produced the concept that changed the world. Now that in and of itself is worth recognising. To once in our intellectual lives, just once, to do something so profound that the world just shakes a little bit. Fantastic. Now they did that. Now, they started by offering a concept that was used in criminology, and they provided a crucial lesson and a crucial intervention about why thought work matters to scholars, and matters now more than ever. Because, interestingly enough, this article, published in the 1950s, still remains incredibly highly cited in the 21st century. Wow. So Sykes and Matza were criminologists, and they were interested in how criminals commit crimes without suffering guilt. So in other words, how do offenders make sense of their crimes and make sense of their behaviours? What a great project. And that's a great question. As I often say to you, when I'm doing interviews to hire people as academics, one of the questions I always ask is, what societal problem are you solving through your research? So Sykes and Matza had a good one. They created the techniques of neutralization, working powerfully against the dominant theories of the time about subculture. It's hard, subculture still exists for us now, but it's hard to explain how powerful subculture as an explanation for behaviour was in the 1950s. Unbelievable. So they had this mass of intellectual work that they were critiquing, took courage. And they showed how individuals make excuses that allow them, give them permission to undertake dodgy behaviours. So Sykes and Matza outlined 5 techniques of neutralisation that allows us to do the wrong thing. And these 5 techniques are, how brilliant is this? Denial of responsibility, denial of injury, denial of the victim, condemnation of the condemners, and appeals to higher loyalties. Now, if you recognise this script from the current shape of political debates, you would be absolutely 100% right. So how do we justify the unjustifiable? How do we justify the scale of poverty on this planet? How do we justify the complexity of the health crisis and the economic crisis at the moment? Why are the attacks on people in social media so brutalising? And indeed, why did the capital of the United States get overrun by rioters? And the answer is denial of responsibility, denial of injury, denial of the victim, condemning the condemners, and appeal to higher loyalties. Techniques of neutralisation are obviously seen most overtly in rapes, in domestic violence, in genocide, but we also see it every single day on Twitter. Every mention, for example, of all lives matter, rather than Black Lives Matter. That is, of course, denying the victim. Just because you save the whales doesn't mean you kill the dolphins. Cool. And the great thing is that the gentleman had a second part to their argument, which is even more powerful, I think. And they argue that when these groups come together and share their techniques of neutralisation, so this group come together, they communicate and validate these techniques within that group, and then the ideas become even more extreme. Wow. So this group of people can then further disconnect from normative knowledge and information discussions and frameworks and increase the strength of their justifications and their excuses because they've shared it with others. So sometimes I don't like the phrase conspiracy theories, right? I think that's problematic. You can see, though, the technique of neutralisation is actually what a conspiracy theory is. So a group of people get together, share something a bit weird, and it becomes weirder. Yep, boom. So when the techniques of neutralisation are shared, extreme views become more extreme. Okay. And also with deterritorialised media, it means that those extreme views that in an analogue time might have been isolated to a town or a suburb or a street, so about 3 people in a street doing something a bit weird. Of course, with deterritorialised social media, through Twitter, through the dark web, if you want to go there, these groups, thousands, millions of people are able to talk and engage, so the group becomes larger as well as becoming more extreme. How fascinating is this? So does that explain in some ways the swarms on social media? So something happens and one poor person, the whole of the internet attacks this person for a day. So these are techniques of neutralisation, a justification, an excuse to maintain an irrational idea like racism, for example, abuse that's sort of attacking relatively straightforward normative views, like if you're a human, you know, humans are pretty equal. It's pretty hard to argue against, there's a human, they're equal. You know, they breathe, they have rights. Pretty hard to argue against that, but techniques of neutralisation do that. So we start to get to a point with techniques of neutralisation that the normative practices of showing kindness or compassion or decency or respect, they start to be attacked. So if you think about it this way, that's happened in the last, say, 3 years. How is it reasonable or logical to term someone a snowflake? You know, that's been one of the weird things from the last 3 or 4 years. It's like anyone that's critiquing anything in these normative, you know, alternative extreme cultures is called a snowflake. So where's that come? And of course it's justified through techniques of neutralisation, where words are used repetitively, right, to critique people who differ from this extreme community's views. So anyone, you know, women, Indigenous community, citizens of colour, citizens with disabilities in particular, anything that seemed to be triggering to a snowflake is using this type of language. Amazing, isn't it? So as you can see, hate speech, brutalising language is used to protect a vulnerable self-concept by hitting out at others to protect that vulnerable self-concept. It's reacting with excuses rather than thinking with views, arguments, opinions, evidence. So where this theory becomes so incredibly powerful is that these extreme views become more and more and more extreme. And in fact, there is no limitation on how extreme these views can go. Think genocide. So this argument is probably more relevant and actionable now than when they developed it, right? Think about social media. Social media creates a bubble. We know that. We pretty well always talk to people on social media who agree with us. And look, that's okay. If you're on Facebook and you're in a Facebook group that talks about orchids, you know, all the orchid people get together. I love me an orchid, 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 orchid. That's great. Knock yourself out, orchids. You know, the chess people who get together, speak their own language, do the weird thing. That's fantastic. The chess people, they're great. The other great example I use are the dancing robot people. You know, the people that build and develop and program dancing robots? They're a great community. I love me a dancing robot. They get together, dancing robots, wonderful. But the problem is this social media bubble is also an echo chamber. So views which are racist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic are amplified when neutralised by this self-generating mob. So techniques of neutralisation actually block thinking. The injustices that we walk past are the injustices that we accept. So therefore we as university academics have a profound role. Our most important role is intervening in these techniques of neutralisation. Our role is to not walk past those injustices. So this work requires some discomfort because we've got to work through the justifications, the excuses for racism, for nationalism, for violence, for economic short-sightedness, for poverty, for the climate emergency. And we've got to start to break down these techniques of neutralisation. So the university academic's role is to intervene in these. This is what we do for a living, thought work. It is important to acknowledge the great scholars that have preceded us, and I hope today is part of that great homage. We have a great legacy. Being a scholar, you should be proud of that. We have great scholars who have preceded us. But I did also want to recognise 3 great new books in exactly this area that is helping us as scholars to remember that we think, and that thought work is our first job. And firstly, the wonderful Elizabeth Minnick, wow, what a writer, Michelle Quinn Patton, published in 2019, the fine book Thought Work. It's a great book. So Minnick and Patton, edited collection, fine chapters, very even book too. Every chapter is a great one, Thought Work. And also Alan Jacobs' How to Think, Guide for the Perplexed, published in 2017. That's a nice entry document into these debates, fantastic. And finally, the disturbing and uneven, but still important, What Were We Thinking? A Brief Intellectual History of the Trump Era. And that was published in 2020. So this is the time to be thoughtful and to enact overt thought work. So we as academics, we are thought leaders. We are. But the key question for our time is, what allows you, what allows me, what allows us to think in new ways? How do we enliven our thinking? How do we create new pathways through thought? So the most important strategy for me to ask you to summon today is, if we're interested in thought work, we must once and for all stop the confusion between experience and thinking. We live each day, we eat, we talk, we scroll on our phone through Instagram, right? That's not thinking. Our experience of life at the moment is not creating thought work. There is a disconnection. And of course, vocabulary matters here. If we do not possess the wide vocabulary, then our thinking is limited by the language we choose. So if we mix with people just like us, our vocabulary does not enlarge, and our tropes, our intellectual architecture also do not enlarge. If vocabulary is limited, thinking is truncated. And that's why higher education and higher degrees matter. So think about this for me. What makes education higher? What makes a degree a higher degree? Breadth, depth, clarity, quality. We avoid a confirmation bias. We seek out differences and we interpret. Alan Dunn argued that, quote, academic work seems as vulnerable to thoughtlessness as any other occupation. And Alan Dunn is, end of quote, and Alan Dunn is right. How we manage that thoughtlessness and critique it in ourselves is to always recognise, I think, the point of departure in our thoughts. This is something I've only realised, to be frank, really in the last 10 years or so. If we really want to engage in our own biases and think them through and think about alternative arguments, we have to take a breath and ask, where does our thinking begin? Where are we beginning our thinking journey? And why have we chosen that moment, that node, as our beginning? We also have to re-establish thinking, use the word thinking, as the point, the spine, the heart, the brain of what we do in our universities. Thinking is disruptive. Thinking inverts. And most importantly, thinking is not ordinary. It is not ordinary. It transcends the ordinary. It critiques the ordinary. Thinking requires detachment. Detachment from the ordinary. Detachment from the everyday. And that is why the university is so precious and so valuable, but it's also vulnerable to those who want to continue to live their lives without thinking, sucking in the air of the boring, the banal. In a time that increasingly requires measurement and metrics, thinking is suggestive. Thinking is exploratory. Thinking may not prove anything. Thinking may lead to knowledge that's measurable and useful. It may not. Thought work provokes us to ask skillful questions and to take the time to ponder the answers. Thinking is not a decision. It is the process to that decision. And that is why, particularly now, there are so many attacks on scholars. Because thinking is not comfortable. In fact, thinking actively critiques comfort. And it's founded on quiet activities. Reading and listening rather than experiencing and talking. And that's why I think thinking is so rare, because it's risky, it's iterative, and it's difficult. And I think that's my problem with critical thinking, because often what it's suggesting is, you know what, you need to think less like yourself. Be critical in your thinking. Be a critical thinker. And you need to think more accurately, which of course is more like me. So you're wrong, I'm right, and I'm going to talk you through the steps of critical thinking so you can think more like me. Technique of neutralization. Only joking slightly. So what we think determines belonging and non-belonging. And thinking doesn't aim to change someone's mind. It respects differences and respects the courage to be different rather than drift into these techniques of neutralization. And I hope that's what these vlogs always do. I'll present an argument and I want you to disagree with me. That's the point. This is creating a thinking space. Here's a series of ideas. Useful, yes, no, but think for me. Think through the argument and then dismiss it, but think through first. And as we look round the current landscape of sickness, of almost unimaginable death, poverty, injustice, energy crises, health crises, unemployment, racism, hostility, anger. We need to stop shaking our heads and saying, I wonder how we got here. Wonder how we got here. Wrong question. We have to ask, what did we think there? What did we think there? And now, how can we think differently? Thinking is a life-affirming activity. And as we're going to crawl out from these health crises, these economic crises, these climate crises, and indeed the crisis of purpose, the university has never been more important, and thinking has never been more important. Thought work is a pathway away from comfort, away from in crowds, and away from safety. But that quiet courage might just create a new way of thinking and a new way of living. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.